Have you ever wondered what really happens to a monarch after death? Not the myths. Not the marble tombs or carefully staged funerals, but the body, the flesh, the bones, the smell. Beneath the powdered faces and portraits of divine authority lies the same truth that meets every human in the end: decay. And few examples reveal that truth with more clarity and quiet horror than the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was never meant to rule. Born into political chaos and religious fracture, her early life was marked by executions, scandal, and exile. Yet by sheer will, intelligence, and circumstance, she ascended to the throne in 1558 and ruled for over 4 decades. She became a symbol of English strength and stability in an age defined by shifting allegiances and foreign threats. Her reign brought relative peace after years of bloody conflict. She solidified Protestantism, established an image of herself as married to the kingdom rather than to any man, and presided over an era of cultural and political transformation. Under her rule, explorers crossed oceans, the arts flourished, and England stood firm against Catholic Europe, most famously in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. But even a queen who stood against popes and kings could not stand against time. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth's health had begun to fail. Her once celebrated red hair was now hidden beneath wigs. Her famously white skin was no longer youthful, but concealed beneath layers of white lead and vinegar-based makeup, poisonous even then. In early March 1603, she withdrew from public life, refusing to lie in bed but standing silently for hours, declining food, speech, and rest. Her death came on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace, just outside London. She was 69 years old. Those present described a slow fading, a queen surrendering not with drama but with quiet resignation. She had no direct heir, the Tudor line ended with her. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in a single monarch. But even before political arrangements could fully settle, the question loomed: what would be done with her body? Elizabeth had reportedly asked her physicians not to embalm her, wishing to meet her God as whole and untouched as she had lived. But royal tradition, and the practicalities of a public funeral, took precedence. Embalming in the early 17th century was neither ceremonial nor scientific. It was brutal. It was necessary. Once dead, her body would have immediately begun to swell with internal gases. Left untouched, she could have decomposed before the eyes of the court during the funeral proceedings. This was not a distant concern. There were documented cases of royal coffins bursting open from internal pressure, staining the ceremony with uncontainable horror. That fate could not be risked for the Queen of England. And so, her body was moved in secret to be embalmed, the standard method of the day involving the surgical removal of internal organs such as the heart, lungs, stomach, and intestines. These were replaced with strongly scented herbs and spices: myrrh, cloves, cinnamon, and perhaps even lavender. These were not acts of reverence. They were a race against rot. A desperate attempt to mask the smell of decomposition that would otherwise escape before her burial. Once prepared, Elizabeth's body was wrapped in crimson velvet, embroidered with Tudor roses, and placed into a lead-lined coffin, not just to preserve dignity, but to contain what time would inevitably unleash. Lead coffins were designed to slow decomposition, to trap odors and gases, and to maintain an illusion that royalty remained untouchable even in death. Following the embalming, preparations began for one of the most elaborate royal funerals of the early modern period. Elizabeth's body remained at Richmond Palace for several days before being moved to Whitehall, where it lay in state. Her coffin, adorned in velvet and resting beneath a canopy, became the center of national mourning. Thousands passed by to pay their respects, many for the last time. For a queen who had become a symbol of national unity, this final public display carried immense political and emotional weight. On April 28, 1603, more than a month after her death, Elizabeth I was transported to her final resting place. The journey was carefully orchestrated. At the break of day, her coffin was placed aboard a royal barge, draped in black cloth and carried down the River Thames, flanked by oarsmen in black and watched by silent crowds lining the riverbanks. The river procession moved slowly from Whitehall to Westminster. Church bells tolled across the city. Nobles, courtiers, and commoners all gathered to witness the passage. The Queen, who had defied Spain and ruled without a husband, was now reduced to a single, unmoving presence, a box of velvet and lead floating toward eternity. The coffin was then carried on land in a grand funeral procession, with a ceremonial effigy of Elizabeth, lifelike and dressed in royal robes, mounted atop the coffin. Behind it walked hundreds of mourners, including peers of the realm, judges, heralds, and bishops. The symbolism was powerful. The body of the Queen had passed, but her image, her icon, continued upright, undisturbed. Inside Westminster Abbey, a service was held before she was entombed in a vault beneath the floor of the Lady Chapel, built by Henry VII, her grandfather. A large monumental tomb was erected above her, an alabaster effigy of Elizabeth, lying in state, eyes closed, hands clasped in prayer, draped in a flowing robe with a scepter and orb. But beneath the sculpture, beneath the marble, beneath the silence, time was already at work. Elizabeth was buried in the same tomb that already held her half-sister, Mary I, a woman she had once imprisoned and ultimately succeeded. Their lives had been divided by religion and politics. Mary was a devout Catholic, Elizabeth a Protestant reformer. Their reigns were filled with conflict, and their relationship was defined by mutual distrust. And yet, in death, they were placed together, not out of sentiment, but out of space and practicality. Mary's coffin lay below. Elizabeth's was placed above. For the public, the funeral was a final act of national reverence. For historians, it marked the close of the Tudor era. But for the embalmed body of the Queen, the journey had just begun. For over 2 centuries, the tomb of Elizabeth I remained sealed beneath the abbey floor. Generations of visitors walked above her resting place, reading inscriptions and admiring the sculpted effigy without ever suspecting what was slowly happening below. Although lead coffins were thought to preserve their contents, in truth, they only delayed what could never be stopped. By the mid-1800s, during the reign of Queen Victoria, there was a renewed interest in the royal tombs of Westminster Abbey. The Victorians had a particular fascination with death, burial practices, and the hidden corners of history. In this context, Dean Arthur Stanley, then Dean of Westminster, was granted permission to inspect and document several of the ancient crypts beneath the abbey, including that of Elizabeth I. Armed with lanterns and curiosity, Stanley and his assistants descended into the dark, stone-lined chamber where the coffins of both Elizabeth I and Mary I had been placed centuries earlier. What they found was far from the pristine image preserved above ground. Elizabeth's lead coffin had buckled under the pressure of centuries of internal gases and moisture. The wooden casing had deteriorated, reduced in parts to powder. The once rich crimson velvet that had wrapped her body was now stained, brittle, and discolored. Even the lead shell, crafted to contain and protect her remains, had warped and sagged. The initials ER, Elizabeth Regina, could still be faintly read on the outer layer, but the overall structure of the coffin had collapsed inward. The pressure from inside had slowly distorted the casing, and the risk of rupture had been real. There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that at some point a breach had occurred. That gases had escaped. That a faint odor, sweet and sour, had hung in the air of the crypt. Some even claimed that fragments of cloth, or even human remains, were briefly visible before the tomb was resealed. No official documentation confirms these accounts, but the visual and olfactory evidence described by those present left little doubt. The coffin had not preserved the Queen's body. It had merely postponed nature's process. This wasn't unusual. Other royal coffins of the era, especially those embalmed using similar 16th century techniques, had suffered similar fates. The embalming methods used during Elizabeth's time focused more on delaying public embarrassment than on true long-term preservation. The organ removal and herbal packing could slow decay for weeks or months, but not for centuries. And yet, what had once been hidden beneath layers of fabric, ritual, and reverence had now begun to seep. Time, gases, moisture, and silence had done their work. When Elizabeth I was laid to rest in 1603, her coffin was carefully placed above that of her half-sister and former rival, Mary I. It was not an act of forgiveness, nor a gesture of reconciliation. It was simply a matter of space. The Lady Chapel had limited room for royal burials, and placing one queen atop the other was a practical solution, not a poetic one. But history has a way of shaping practicality into symbolism. In life, Elizabeth and Mary had been divided by everything. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a devout Catholic who attempted to restore Roman Catholicism in England during her reign from 1553 to 1558. Her efforts included the persecution of Protestants, earning her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose marriage to Henry had triggered England's break with the Catholic Church. When Elizabeth became queen, she restored the Protestant Church of England and positioned herself as the antithesis of her sister's rule. Their approaches to religion, diplomacy, and power could not have been more different. Their personal relationship was marked by suspicion and political maneuvering. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, suspected of involvement in Protestant uprisings. Though released, she lived under constant surveillance until Mary's death in 1558 finally cleared the path to the throne. And yet, for all their opposition in life, they were entombed together, sharing not just a chapel but a single vertical vault. Mary's coffin lies beneath, Elizabeth's above, a positioning that has led some historians to interpret this as a final act of dominance, with Elizabeth metaphorically resting on top of her older sister's legacy. It is a compelling visual, but also a poignant one. The two queens, once symbols of division and religious strife, now reduced to decaying bones sharing the same narrow chamber, their distinctions blurred by time. Protestant and Catholic, Tudor and Tudor, power and frailty, all now indistinguishable beneath layers of stone and silence. This shared burial speaks volumes about the nature of monarchy and the limits of legacy. Despite the grandeur of royal life, both women met the same physical end. Their bodies followed the same biological script: gas, collapse, erosion, and were eventually sealed in the same vault, subject to the same decay, the same neglect, and the same curious eyes centuries later. To visitors in Westminster Abbey, the tomb may appear unified and regal. But below, the materials tell another story: warped lead, rotting velvet, and the slow collapse of two once feared sovereigns. In recent years, the question has quietly emerged in academic and archaeological circles: should Elizabeth I's tomb be reopened? From a scientific standpoint, there's undeniable appeal. Advances in forensic analysis, bioarchaeology, and DNA sequencing could allow researchers to uncover new details about Elizabeth's health, cause of death, or even the effects of long-term exposure to the lead-based cosmetics she famously wore. Her remains might contain evidence of chronic poisoning, illness, or physical conditions that were concealed behind the careful royal image of strength and agelessness. Historians, too, are intrigued. The embalming practices of the early 1600s remain poorly understood. Studying the state of Elizabeth's body, if it remains even partially intact, could shed light on Tudor funeral customs, anatomical knowledge of the time, and the effectiveness, or failure, of preservation methods used in royal burials. But the practical and ethical concerns are equally serious. Lead coffins from the early modern period are notoriously unstable. Over time, as internal gases build and moisture accumulates, pressure within the coffin increases. Opening such a container after more than 400 years poses not just logistical risks, but also health hazards. The sudden release of trapped gases or airborne pathogens, however unlikely, cannot be dismissed. More than that, there is the issue of respect. Elizabeth herself requested that her body not be cut or disturbed. That wish was ignored once at her death, when embalming was carried out against her will. Would disturbing her now, centuries later, represent a second violation? Would opening the tomb for the sake of research, or curiosity, cross a moral line? Westminster Abbey is not a lab. It is a sacred and national site, one where monarchs lie not just in rest, but in representation. To open her coffin would mean not only examining a corpse, but revisiting a national myth, unwrapping the final symbol of Gloriana herself. Even if done with surgical precision and scholarly intent, it would be difficult to avoid spectacle. The media coverage. The public reaction. The inevitable comparisons to other high-profile exhumations, like those of Richard III or Tutankhamun. In trying to understand Elizabeth more deeply, we risk reducing her to a forensic object, her myth undone not by scandal, but by science. There is also the lingering symbolism. Elizabeth's reign was defined by control over her image, her policies, her court, and even her celibacy. She curated herself carefully, choosing how the world would remember her. To open her tomb would be, in a way, to undo the final illusion she constructed, the seamless merging of woman and monarch, of body and legend. The debate remains unresolved. Some argue for limited, non-invasive testing, using technology like ground-penetrating radar or fiber-optic probes to assess the condition of the vault without opening it. Others insist that the tomb must remain closed indefinitely, a monument not only to a queen, but to the boundaries between the past and the present, the sacred and the curious. What is certain is this: Elizabeth I still fascinates. Not because of what she left behind in books or portraits, but because her body remains sealed, untouched, unresolved, a question buried beneath stone, velvet, and time. Elizabeth I ruled a kingdom with absolute control, but she could not control her decay. Her tomb at Westminster Abbey is more than a royal resting place. It is a reminder of mortality, a space where power, flesh, and myth converge. Inside that coffin lies not just a body, but a story, of embalming herbs that failed to halt decomposition, of velvet that rotted instead of preserving dignity, of a lead shell meant to seal eternity now warped by the centuries. Her bones no longer echo with command. Her crown, buried with her, rusts in darkness. Perhaps that's why her story continues to captivate. Because in the quiet pressure of that sealed coffin is the final lesson of monarchy, that even those who ruled empires become dust and questions, relics and cautionary tales. To open that coffin would be to seek truth. To leave it closed is to honor mystery. Either way, Elizabeth I remains what she always was in life, a mirror to her people, reflecting both the brilliance and the fragility of human ambition. If this story gave you a new perspective on power, decay, and the silence of history, consider supporting the channel by giving it a like and subscribing for more deep, thoughtful journeys into the past. And now, a question for you. Should Elizabeth I's tomb be opened, or should some mysteries remain sealed forever? Let us know what you think in the comments.